So, sport and the European Union, to begin with. What do we do with the European Union for sport? Our work focuses on two things. One is promoting and the other is protecting sport. So we try to promote sport as a vehicle for social change. There's plenty of literature which proves that sport can be very useful for a whole number of social objectives. For example, enhancing physical activity. And we work a lot on, for example, funding projects, collaborative projects, to make sure that public policy officials are able to see the value of sport in promoting health. Same for social inclusion. For example, disability, migration is becoming more and more relevant, or disadvantaged youth. And of course there, we talk about disadvantaged youth, there's also the informal learning element involved in when you promote sport. Now, promoting sport is very linked to protecting sport, because if you look at the sporting pyramid, you want top, the professional level, to function well, to function in a stable environment, so that it's also able to inspire the base of the pyramid, the grassroots level, for all of this to come together and really maximize the impact. So we protect sport on a number of different levels. We work with all the member states in a coordinated fashion, for example, to tackle match fixing, to tackle doping, violence, and other forms of intolerance in sport. Of course, good governance is a very pertinent subject, and legal stability, making sure that corruption is tackled, making sure that association, shall we say, with the highest level of sport is something very positive and not the opposite. And this is where a little bit we touch the industry. Sponsorship, for example, is very important. Sponsors want to associate themselves with organizations and with sports disciplines which are inspiring and are less interested, for example, to invest in sport if the image is a tarnished one. So it's important to look at this and make sure that the member states were all working together in order to maximize, to really improve governance across the board. And of course, we look at also the purely economic dimension of sport. So looking at the sports industry as a massive export and a massive sizable, shall we say, chunk of European exports. Somebody mentioned earlier professional football, for example, and the Champions League, or for example, the Premier League or the other national leagues, and this being, if you will, our Hollywood. I really much like that expression. I think I'm going to use it. But there's a lot behind that. We have a lot of value in our sport, which is also important on the global stage. And so it's important to think about these things and make sure we're protecting it and we take all the necessary measures in order for this to be able to flourish. Of course, I'm talking from the perspective of the sports unit of the European Commission. There are also other departments of the European Commission, like competition policy, or people who are working on the digital single market, on IPR protection, purely, specifically on IPR protection, who also deal with this subject. But the angle I'm taking today is one from the sports unit. Now, in doing all of this, in working towards protecting and promoting sport, the first question we have to ask ourselves is the evidence base. What are we talking about, and what is the nature of the beast, shall we say? So in 2007, the White Paper on Sport highlighted the importance of sound knowledge base in order to inform policy making. This, shall we say, was the first paper at the level of the European Commission on sport, and I think it set the stage. Since then, we've developed a lot this notion of working on the evidence base. So the work started in 2011 and 14 at what we call the EU Work Plan for Sport. And there we looked at the economic aspects of sports, becoming for the first time a priority for the work plan. And a dedicated expert group was set up on statistics. And it was mandated to recommend ways to promote data collection, because data collection is the very first step in our efforts to capture what we're talking about when we mean the sports sector and the industry. They work mainly through what we call sport satellite accounts. I'll come back to that in a moment. And at the political level of the Council of European Union, we have Council conclusions in 2012, 13, and 14, which highlight this kind of political importance attached to the evidence base to begin with, and then the contribution of sports to the economy at the next step. The current work plan, so this is the second work plan for sport, continues this emphasis on the economic dimension of sport and the economic benefits of sport. We have again an expert group dedicated to the economic dimension of sport, and our Lithuanian colleagues are very active, I have to say. Vilma participates in this expert group, and I'd be interested actually to hear later her thoughts. One of the things it's working on is putting together recommendations on measuring the economic benefits of sport. So this is an ongoing challenge, and I want to highlight here that we haven't solved this problem. We're taking steps towards measuring the size and then the benefits of sport. But this is an ongoing effort, and the challenge is so large that we're anywhere near done yet. A very important step in this effort was a study undertaken in 2012 on the contribution of sport to economic growth and employment. This was, shall we say, a landmark document perhaps when it comes to measuring the size of this sector. So the study was undertaken by a consortium. It was led by Sports Econ Austria, and it was commissioned by the European Commission. And they worked through sports satellite accounts. Now, sports satellite accounts, I'm not going to tire you with too much detail on this, but basically it's an accounting methodology. So it filters national accounts for sport-related activity, and it extracts those figures. And the aim of the study was to provide high-quality macroeconomic statistics about the sports economy. The methodology, as I said, is very complex. It involves algorithms. It involves all sorts of assumptions and things, which are not for us to examine right now. But what I want to say about this study is that the sports satellite accounts can be done either at the European level, like SPEA did for this study, and that's a little bit, shall we say, to a certain degree of depth, because there's a lot of proxies, there's a lot of assumptions, because the data is not always available in all the member states. The SPEA study looked at 27 member states at the time. But then when satellite accounts are done at the national level, there you can go into a lot more detail, and there the numbers are much, much more reliable and relevant, shall we say. So the study looked at what we call the Vilnius definition of sport. This is the three levels of sport when we're looking at it as an economic activity. The first, the statistical definition, is what we call purely sporting activities. So things like swimming pools, stadia, and the activities of professional sports clubs. So this is really the core, shall we say, of sport. When we go to the narrow definition, we also include all the services and goods that are necessary for sports to take place. So for example, your footwear, clothing, the equipment, all the equipment behind. And I like the word weapons in this list. They're talking about shotguns, for example, or maybe archery, if that qualifies as a weapon. And then perhaps the most interesting is the broad definition. The broad definition takes the first two, but also adds activities that require sports as an input. For example, TV broadcast, which is a very important element in all of this. And then things like dietary supplements, hotels, restaurants, for veterinary services, if you think, for example, about horses, etc. And health services, because we're all getting injured all the time, aren't we? So the broad definition, I think, is the one that's really most interesting at this stage. So let's look at some of the outcomes. I want to put some figures to this. So I explained a little bit how we started to look at this, and this is a little bit some numbers which I picked out of the study for you. So the share of sports-related gross value added of the total EU gross value added is 0.28% for the statistical definition, 1.13 for the narrow, and 1.76 for the broad definition. However, when you add to that the multiplier effects, 1.76 goes up to 2.98. That's 294 billion euro. So from our perspective, when we talk about the size of the sports industry, the contribution of sports to the economy, the number we use is this 3% figure. I'd also say that the study claims that that's larger than forestry, fisheries, and agriculture put together. I've always had my doubts about that. Some other interesting data, for example. The study claims that the GVA per capita is higher in higher income member states. So that means that we're talking about 5 to 10 euros per capita, where income is lower in Europe, and where income is higher, so for example, Western Europe mainly, the number moves up to somewhere between 50 and 100 euros per capita. And it highlights also certain sectors which are particularly important. Tourism, for example, Austria. Austria is really a case in point, where you have a sort of ski tourism, for example, or anything related to snow. So that's a particular, shall we say, peak. Fitness and media. Fitness, Sweden and Denmark are singled out for fitness centers and the importance to the economy. Media, of course, when we talk about the UK, notably professional football. And education, interestingly enough, in the Baltic states and in Denmark. This is a little indicator. I put a few graphs in this, a few charts just to color the presentation and give you a picture of what we're talking about. And you can see there, for example, the education services and hotel and restaurant services. Hotel and restaurant services is interesting. It's 17 billion, which is 10% of the broad definition, shall we say, roughly, just as a figure to picture this. Moving on, the study also had a number of other outcomes. For example, it talked about employment. So the contribution of sports-related employment to total employment is 2.12%. Again, we're talking about the broad definition. But if you move on to include multipliers and indirect effects, then it goes up to 3.5%, or 7.4 million employees. Now, if you compare that to the 3% figure we said before, then it becomes clear that we're talking about a very labor-intensive industry. So in terms of political interest in this field, I think there's another step of interest here, because it's a very labor-intensive industry in Europe. There are particularly high multiplier effects in certain areas highlighted by the study, like construction, for example, and tourism. And the elasticity, interestingly enough, is 1.14. That means that for every increase of €1 in income, sports-related expenditure increases by 1.14. And I like this line here where they say every 60th euro generated and earned in the European Union is sports-related. So they give us an interesting picture of what's going on in terms of production and in terms of employment in the European Union in relation to the sports sector. This is the employment chart. You see the EU in the middle, around 2.12%. Where's Lithuania? On the lower end, they're around 1%. Austria, as I said before, higher than 5%. Luxembourg was a bit of an interesting case. The claim in the study is that Luxembourg's almost artificially high because of the high number of workers who come into Luxembourg, spend in Luxembourg, but actually live outside Luxembourg. But that money is attributed to Luxembourg because the production is done there. So taking the process forward, so that was in 2012. We made this study. The first time we had European level figures, at least for us, in this field. Now we are currently looking at the contribution of sports to the employability of young people. So not just looking at the sports sector and its industry per se, but also the impact it can have on employability of young people, particularly today where we have such high unemployment across Europe. The sports satellites accounts, as I said, when the study was conducted, it was conducted with lots of proxies at the European level. Around 9 member states have actually launched sports satellite accounts in detail at the national level. The others are hesitating or haven't found the political, shall we say, will to do so, or the funds, or whatever the reason. But what we're doing now is we're also doing a study on the implementation of these sports satellite accounts, what works well, what works less well, how to cut some corners, how to get to the real figures quickly and effectively. And we're working with various member states in order to help them develop these sports satellite accounts. At the same time, of course, there's policy work ongoing, focusing on good governance, on things like the digital single market and the impact, for example, of sport in the digital single market. We're in very close contact with our colleagues who deal with the digital single market to make sure that things like cross-border access, for example, and portability, when these things are being discussed and the regulations are being drawn up, they are acutely aware of the impact this could have on sport, so that we make an informed decision at the end of the day. Financial fair play, of course, that's an example specific to football. But there's a lot of policy work ongoing constantly with stakeholders from the field of sport in order to maintain a certain, shall we say, stability, especially legal stability in the area. And on the promoting side, we've developed the European Week of Sport, which started in 2015 for the first time in September. So a real push, a very decentralized push. So it's not something Brussels-centered. We put together a little bit the package, and then various stakeholders, national authorities, but also partners like FESI, like the European Sports Goods Industry Federation, and Olympic committees, for example. They're running with this idea of the European Week of Sport, and they're dedicating 1 week in September. It will happen again in September 2016, in order to push people to get off the couch and promote physical activity and sport in any kind of different form. It doesn't have to be competitive elite sport. We're also talking about grassroots sport. So, for example, dancing in central squares, this kind of thing, the full range. And then there's the health enhancing physical activity recommendation. This is a very interesting case because we have a council recommendation on health enhancing physical activity. It dates to 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a set of indicators on public policy. And at the end of this year, we'll be drawing up a report to see, okay, so the council made this recommendation to the member states. 3 years down the line, where are we? What measures have member states taken to implement these recommendations? I'm not saying it's an obligation to implement them, but it would be very interesting to engage in this exercise and see how member states have started developing this idea of health enhancing physical activity on the ground, and if actually they're succeeding through that to promote physical activity. A very important part of our taking the process forward of our next steps, shall we say, is Eurostat. Eurostat's the European Commission's statistical service, and we have an agreement with them which is going to last for 4 years, and they're spending 3 full-time experts who work exclusively on sports and culture statistics. So they're developing for the first time solid statistics at the European level. Now, working with Eurostat is a little bit trickier. When Sports Econ Austria and the consortium did a study, they had, shall we say, a certain degree of flexibility and freedom in, for example, introducing assumptions into the calculations and making proxies and stuff. When it comes to Eurostat data, they work directly with statistical officers, and they work in a very structured way. And it's not so easy for Eurostat, for example, to make assumptions and show that kind of flexibility, shall we say, when they're putting together the numbers. So the numbers, I think, are much more rigid. They will take longer to develop, but they will be certainly much more well-founded, shall we say. Now, there's a task force set up by Eurostat as well, with member states' representatives who all make sure that we're all on the same page and they agree about the data that we're collecting. And they also make it available, which is a challenge in itself. So we're already starting to see the first outputs of Eurostat's work. They're looking at employment in sport, international trade, attendance in live sports events, and things like private expenditure on sporting goods and services. And I think this has a lot of potential to get really interesting in due course. As I said, this is just the beginning of our work with Eurostat. So here we have the share of extra-EU imports of sporting goods. And this is in, so it's, the calculations are made in the value in euros. So it's interesting that sports footwear is a big import sector. Boats and water sport equipment is another one. Gymnastics, athletics, and swimming equipment, the third biggest, shall we say. Looking at exports, the boats and the water sport equipment take up the largest chunk, 57%. Now, as I said, it's not, I mean, I'd like to hear perhaps from industry representatives if they feel that this is really reflecting their understanding of the numbers as well, because as I said, when we work with Eurostat and the national statistical offices, often some of the categories lend themselves to this kind of statistical work. A lot of the time, though, they don't, and you need to get a subcategory which doesn't exist, so people don't classify things, for example, in exports and imports. They don't break down into smaller categories, and it's very difficult at the level of all the member states to then make assumptions about subcategories, and sometimes we hit walls when we're doing this work. So this is the first, shall we say, raw material, the raw data that's coming out. They looked a little bit at attendance of live sport events. Did the colors come out well? Yeah, kind of. So the yellow is people who have not attended in the last 12 months. Blue is 1 to 6 times they've attended. And then the red, shall we say, is people who attend more frequently, more than 6 times in the last 12 months. It was very interesting to see that and sort of think about the policy implications that might have. Private household expenditure on sporting goods and services. So recreational and sporting services is the biggest chunk, and then you have major durables for outdoor recreation, and then there's camping and open air recreation. Indoor recreation is the blue, and then maintenance and repair of, these are the major durables for recreation and culture as well. These are 2010 figures, by the way, 2011 for the attendance. At this point, I have to say that the study we did in 2012 was based on 2005 data. So looking a little bit at the challenges ahead, that's the first challenge, that this data of the 2012 studies goes back to 2005, 11 years down the road. So there is an effort to sort of revisit the exercise of that study and update the data. And as I said also, in terms of rolling out the sports satellite accounts across the EU, this is really important, and we're engaging in workshops and we're offering all sorts of technical assistance to various member states to see if they can really develop this data. But it's not easy. It's not easy because there is varying degrees of political interest, shall we say, political will in various member states to actually sit down and think about how much depth they want to go into sports data. There's also a cost, of course. The standardization of work is a challenge. It's not easy when we work either with Eurostat or even with SPEA. The collection of data, as I said, is a challenge, but also the categories. The categories are not often the same. You need to work a lot on getting the corresponding categories correct and really making the data comparable. And of course, Eurostat work is in progress. It's growing. It's a, shall we say, a big machine, but it's really taking off a little bit. And we expect to have more interesting data as time goes by, especially in this 4-year agreement we have. And then there's, of course, this question of costs, which are often not factored into all of this analysis. So that on the one side, we have physical inactivity. There was a recent study done by ISCA, the International Sports and Culture Association. They estimated physical inactivity costs at 80 billion euro, which is quite significant if we're looking at it also in relation to the number we mentioned before of about 294 billion euro. And counterfeiting, of course, which is more connected to what this conference is going to be talking about today. There's an estimation from OHIM of 500 million euro and almost 3,000 jobs annually lost because of counterfeiting. So that's another element which we're looking at a little bit, which we will be looking at a little bit more closely. in the future in terms of measuring the benefit of sports, shall we say. And then another category is voluntary work. Now this is a big chapter because the vast majority of people working in sports organizations are doing so voluntarily, especially at the grassroots level. Everything that goes on at the grassroots level is entirely voluntary. Now, should this be calculated? Should these man-hours be factored in? And how do you do that? And this is a big challenge. And there's a lot of discussion amongst member states on whether or not we should be including this in the calculations. But it has been flagged, shall we say, as something which we should be looking at, and we'll do so in due course. And of course, in terms of challenges ahead, there's all our policy work on promoting and protecting sports. So all these numbers I mentioned for the sports sector, that's part of building the evidence base and seeing what we're talking about. And then once we have a clearer picture of the nature of the beast, as I said before, then the real work for us is to promote it for all its value in social terms, and also protect it for all its value in commercial and economic terms as a very sizable chunk of the European economy. And I hope that today's conference, looking at the IPR dimension of sport, will be a step in exactly that direction. Thank you very much.